This work um, is not about really platform technologies. It is more the latter stream, societal consequences of technology, and organizational consequences of technology. Hopefully, I'll sell you on that latter statement as we go. The work is joint with Brad Greenwood, who's at George Mason. He's on sabbatical, actually. He's at Georgetown for the year. And then Jeremy Watson, who was at the University of Minnesota, but recently left to join Meta. And what we're studying here is gunshot detection technologies, and we're trying to understand the broad impact on the practices of police. A little bit on the behavior of citizens too, as you'll see. Um, and originally, this paper was very much framed. I was saying this before everybody started to join. This paper was originally framed very heavily as being about monitoring technology and the effect of monitoring on employees. But the paper's in the midst of a pivot in terms of framing toward organizational adoption of IT for automation. So you'll see why as we go, but I will note this paper is, we have a revise and resubmit at Management Science at the IS desk for this paper. And so we're working on that reframing and also a little bit on trying to understand mechanisms. So really looking forward to getting feedback as we go. I have been plugging another paper when I give talks. I won't spend a ton of time on this. It's a bit of a, I don't want to call it orthogonal, but it's kind of a methodological paper. And if you have ever run or sought to run experiments using online platforms, advertiser experimentation tools, so that's, Instagram, Facebook, TikTok, what have you. All of these platforms provide advertisers with split testing tools, A/B testing tools. And in marketing especially, but a bit in IS and other disciplines, people have used these tools for testing theory on if I, try to engage to get vaccine uptake, what kind of messaging should I use? These types of things. Some papers have recently flagged that the way these tools operate, if you're not really aware of what's going on in the background, they are not exactly going to deliver an experiment like you would typically want to run as an academic. The main problem being they randomize the whole population of the platform, let's say, across conditions. But then what happens is they don't log what happens for every user in each condition because that would be way too much data and you'd have very noisy, hard to detect effects in such big populations. So what they do is they log if treatment is actually encountered, i.e., did a delivery algorithm show you the ad? And so what you end up with is systematically different subpopulations in each condition that are not comparable. And then it becomes hard to disentangle. Was it the ad contents effect or was it the composition of the audience that was different that drove my results? You can't tell. So these papers have brought this up. I have a paper. I've been working as part of Central Applied Science like one day a week at Meta. So we have a paper recently with Brett Gordon and a few other people at Meta where we've been doing large scale meta-analyses of meta advertiser experiments. So meta-analyses. So hundreds of thousands of A/B tests that advertisers have run to try to understand, okay, yes, this is a problem. Here's how bad it is. And if you set up your experiment like this, the problem is minimized. And basically the goal is use optimization function objectives that do not personalize delivery. So maximizing eyeballs essentially is the main thing. So check this paper out if you've ever thought about using that method. You might find it useful and informative. Okay. Back to this paper, which has nothing to do with what I was just talking about. Big picture, we're going to examine gunshot detection technologies, and we're going to look at broad impacts on policing outcomes, which are reflective of police behavior, but also a bit citizen behavior. I want to note that the technology we're studying here is pretty heavily concentrated in the United States, but there are equivalent products that are being used in Europe and Asia. They're just sold by different companies primarily. I'll show you the distribution actually of where the microphones are from this company in a little bit. We are going to be focused on the city of Chicago. The tension here, there's a lot of back and forth in the media. There are lawsuits, and cities are pushing back on claims that are being made in the media and in lawsuits about the effects that these technologies have and how they're used by police. So communities and sort of legal advocates are raising claims that these technologies are deployed in cities in a systematic way, so in very specific neighborhoods, which are the highest crime neighborhoods, but also tend to be neighborhoods where people of color reside. And so the claim is that they're being used as a pretext for over policing. So they kind of serve as a justification. We've received alerts, so we have to come in and talk to people, and this is why we're allowed to be here. That's the criticism and the basis of many lawsuits at the moment. And this has led to several cities in the United States recently canceling their contracts with the company that provides this particular technology, which was called ShotSpotter, and now it's called Sound Thinking, which is, I guess, a more PR appropriate name. Uh, and so Chicago is one of these cities that has canceled their contract in the last year, and the microphones are being taken down. Boston, where I live, has refused to cancel their contract and said, no, the technology works. We can point to concrete instances where it has helped us solve crime, so we are keeping it. What we're trying to do here is understand various claims that are being made, provide some empirical evidence to evaluate them, to inform the decisions that are going on, and also just to more broadly try to understand what's going on in terms of the effect that these technologies have on the way that people are behaving, police are behaving. And often this is going to be unintended consequences because they're not thinking too deeply when they drop the tech in about how processes should maybe work and where the gaps are going to be. So I'm going to show you that contrary to a lot of claims on either side, so both sides are partially right, right? The truth is in the middle somewhere. We find significant reductions in the extent of police interactions with citizens. So what that means is there are fewer people being documented as having been stopped by a police officer on foot in a proactive ad hoc way. Evidence that there may be some passive monitoring happening in lieu of proactive monitoring, which the police used to use these Terry stops, as they're called, for. However, at the same time, what we're going to show is when the police do come and do stop people, they are much more aggressive to the point that it leads to a systematic rise in complaints against officers. So you're seeing this trade between extensive margin of policing for the intensive margin of policing. We're going to find crime rates don't shift as a result of this transition to passive monitoring. Like crime stays stable in terms of what's happening. Closure rates go up in terms of whether an arrest is made for a crime. However, there's a bit of a question as to whether the arrests are legitimate. So I found someone. It doesn't necessarily mean it was the right person. There is an alternative explanation that I'm trying to disentangle, whether that's also partly what's going on, which is these technologies are not perfect. So they're going to trigger alerts that gunshots have been detected. They seem to have high false positive rates, although as I will talk about in a bit, you never really know for sure. And it's impossible to find out, really. As a result, some of this can be misdirection of resources where police are following up on calls that are not real, and that crowds out their time to actually mess with people in an ad hoc way. So that's my active area of empirical investigation right now, is trying to figure out how to disentangle those two things. Just so you know, have that in the back of your head. That's what I'm hoping to resolve. So I can talk a little bit about some preliminary evidence in a different city in Houston, where unlike Chicago, we are able to link an arrest with its GPS coordinates. So was there microphones around when that arrest was made to an arraignment in court? And then was the case dismissed in court? And we are seeing a systematic event study increase in case dismissal rates for arrests made in districts in Houston that had microphones, which suggests invalid arrests, but it's very early results, so I don't want to lean on it too much. Okay, so the broader takeaway, this is the organization, the police department, has some objectives. Their goal is to keep crime down, but also maintain trust and be nice to people, in theory, serve and protect. And then the question is this technology helping or hurting? And it depends how you optimize that objective function, which is multidimensional. And so there's some trade-offs happening between efficacy and efficiency of policing and whether you're actually being nice to people and helping serve your community. Okay. So what are these technologies? There are variants of it. I will say Europe has been a little bit different in that it tends to be the case that these technologies are deployed as part of smart city initiatives. So this is one piece of technology that's being rolled out in tandem with things like closed circuit TV, but other sensory stuff for managing traffic and all kinds of other stuff. Okay. In the US, that's not so much the case. This is a modular thing that's adopted specifically by law enforcement agencies, and it is specifically for crime deterrence. For a long time, it has purely been audio-based. There are closed-circuit TVs around the cities as well, but they're not generally integrated. That's changing. They're starting to deploy the microphones in tandem with video, which may improve accuracy. So the way they work right now, and in our period of study, for these technologies to detect a gunshot, you need triangulation, which is pretty literal. It means you need at least 3 microphones in the area to triangulate GPS coordinates where the gunshot was detected to have originated. and then police can be notified. How that happens is gun goes off. You need the microphones to be deployed in a sort of a grid sort of array in an area. Uh, there's like a machine learning algorithm that's pulling audio from all the microphones, and triangulation is happening in the background. There's an automated detection that happens that a gunshot has been fired. We don't have a whole lot of information about that machine learning model because it's a private product and they don't want to say what their secret sauce is, or how it's really been validated. However, if a gunshot is detected by the system, a notification goes to somebody sitting at a desk in New Jersey. They listen to the recording and then make a human judgment about whether that sounded like a gunshot. And then they notify the local police department to dispatch police. Gunshot happened at this intersection this many minutes ago. This many rounds were fired. So they keep track of how many rounds were detected as well. So this is how it functions. We're going to have data on where microphones are located, when the microphones turn on. We're going to have data on a lot of various policing outcomes, and we're also going to have some manipulation check type data on like gunshot reports from the system and when they start happening in a location. Now, I'll note this company is called Sound Thinking. Alternatives to this, like Thales has a product that they sell, Raytheon. A lot of military contractors sell this stuff because the technology originates from the military for the detection of incoming fire in the field in military settings, and they've just redeployed it into cities. So how common are these things? This is an ugly pixelated map. So I can show you, if you're curious, this is the city of Chicago, okay, where all the microphones are located. So we have sort of specific latitudes and longitudes for every microphone. And I can maybe zoom out here. And you can see like there's little towns like Milwaukee up here.
We're
Uh,
we're still seeing the presentation.
oh, you are. Sorry, I
I
wasn't
think
sharing my
it's
laptop. Thank you for, there you go. So this is city of Chicago. I have the location of every specific microphone in the city. And then we do have broader data on microphones more broadly around the world. So for instance, I have locations for Houston, but there's a lot of smaller towns that adopt these things as well. And there are various, so Singapore has them. There's at least one city in China, and I think London, Ontario, and Canada has them. So there's various places that are trialing these things. Okay. I'm not actually going to necessarily make use of the point data. That was my original objective when I started this project, and then realized it complicates very quickly from a causal inference perspective because you don't have sharp discontinuities, sound travels, and it's not like you can draw clear boundaries very easily without making arbitrary choices about what's the radius, what should it be. And I have no insight about that because I've never seen the data on these systems and how they actually function as sort of private. Okay, so we have these microphone locations. Let me just go back to my presentation. Okay, so they're broadly adopted, especially around the United States. A lot of major cities have adopted these things. And as I mentioned, several of these have canceled contracts recently, although Boston continues to make use of these. That's a notable one for me. So these have been kind of a lightning rod in the media and sort of in the legal sphere for several reasons. So ACLU has filed organized class action lawsuits against the company that sells this product, and as well as against specific cities for claims that, first of all, these things are not effective. They're a waste of taxpayer money. And then at the same time, they're privacy invasive, and they're being deployed systematically in places that are where people of color reside, minority populations in the United States for over policing. And there's even been instances where they're used literally as a pretext, a false pretext. There's at least one anecdote where they got caught, where the police called ShotSpotter and said, "Can you please submit an alert saying a gunshot was fired here to justify my presence post hoc?" So they got caught doing that. That's the basis of one of the ongoing lawsuits. So there is clear evidence that it is possible that this is strictly a pretext in some cases for the police's presence. Okay, so all this stuff is going on. And at the same time, mentioned this, there's lawsuits going on against the city of Chicago, for example, which has led to them canceling the contract and settling to get out of this. But we have the contrast, which is the city of Boston, which came out and said, no, this thing works. We're going to keep using it. I can point at least, 3 or 5 cases that I can talk to you about where this helped us solve a crime because we arrived faster, we arrested somebody in the moment, we found evidence, etc., that we wouldn't have otherwise found. So there is a tension here. And the question is just, which side of this objective function are you on? Are you on the trust and serve side, or are you like the protect side, the deterrence side? I think is part of what's going on here. So the concern is we don't have a lot of empirical evidence either way for either of these claims. We do have some criminology research on these technologies, unsurprisingly. So some people in criminology have done some fairly well identified causal studies to understand the impact that these technologies have on specifically gun crime. So that means, first of all, looking at deterrence effects, like does the presence of these microphones reduce the likelihood that somebody will use a gun? No evidence for that. No result, which is not that surprising if you think about it, because if I'm somebody that's out there and I'm going to pull a gun and shoot at somebody, I'm probably not that thoughtful about if there's like microphones and cameras around. More of the benefits that have been documented are on the back end. So police do arrive faster. So they arrive in 5 to 10 minutes as opposed to 20 to 30 minutes or not at all. Because actually the status quo can be that people don't even bother to call the police if they hear a gunshot because they don't want to get involved. And now we're actually maybe detecting more things that are happening that never would have been followed up on in the past. Um, so gun crime resolution has been found to improve in terms of finding criminals and arresting them. Gun recovery has been found to improve. Collection has been found to improve. But that's specifically in the narrow, it's not a prophylactic benefit, it's a resolution benefit. Now, at the same time, we have some not causal, but at least descriptive reports that suggest that these technologies are super inefficient. So while they may catch some things that were not being caught previously, they're casting a very wide net. And essentially, the precision can be terrible. So the models, so the Office of the Inspector General of Chicago, in Chicago, went and did an audit study, not really an audit study, but a descriptive sort of follow-up on a large volume of ShotSpotter alerts and connected them with police visits or sort of police dispatches and found that 95% of them never resulted in anything. So the police would go, they'd spend 10, 20 minutes at minimum investigating, looking for shells, looking for evidence of crime, somebody to talk to. They'd find nothing and eventually leave. 5% of the time they'd find something, which suggests it's very inefficient potentially, although we don't know how to compare that necessarily with the proactive Terry stop approach, whether that's also completely inefficient. So we don't really know, but it sounds inefficient. There has been some work that's tried to look at this question of whether these technologies are being used in a sort of racially heterogeneous way, like being deployed specifically to target minority populations. That's been pretty descriptive. Largely what's been shown is that the placement of the microphones tends to be in communities of color, where residents are not white, essentially. That is not surprising because although it's not described that way, police departments are very clear that we're buying these to put these in high crime neighborhoods. And you can easily look at the correlations and infer that that's also the population that lives there has certain characteristics. So what we're going to do is try to address all of these things here, like all the things that are coming up in the media that haven't really been talked about yet. And we're going to try to bring sort of a more rigorous causal framework to this question of over-policing of minority populations. Is that happening or not when these microphones are enabled? Okay, so our research question here is, this is a very measures-based research question because it's very concrete, but you can think about this. I can try to recharacterize this in a second. We're going to look at the effect of these technologies when they're deployed on a variety of policing outcomes. So specifically, our primary focus here is on stop volumes and who is being stopped and when, as a measure of the extent of police interaction with citizens. We are then going to also look at arrest outcomes. We're also going to look at whether these stops are resulting in people complaining to a civilian oversight board about mistreatment by the police as an indicator of maybe aggression or intensity of policing. And then we're also going to just try to understand the efficiency argument, like what's happening to crime. And again, arrests, those two pieces of information are going to tell us, is this leading to more efficient outcomes for the organization in terms of protection and crime deterrence? A central thing here that I've not really baked in, but I've alluded to it a little bit, is the performance or the accuracy of the technology is going to play a huge role here in terms of the efficiency argument. right? The extent to which this thing is not accurate, it may drive inefficiency by allocating resources in an inefficient way. The flip side of this, that's not really as obvious, not really the flip side, but a complement to this, is that it also depends a lot on how employees think about the technology, their perceptions of it. So, to the extent that they see it as sort of an oracle, or like somebody paid a lot of money for this thing, it must work, right? It came from the military. I think it's probably right when it says something has happened. They show up and they assume something has happened, which is very different than ad hoc stops of people on the street where you don't know and you're just searching. And so that can maybe be an explanation for the aggression that's happening and the over policing response. Okay, so that's sort of another behavioral response that can arise here. So we're trying to situate this. I'll get through some literature fairly quickly, just in the interest of time, but we're situating this in the literature on sort of the productivity benefits of technology, which is a very long literature in IS and the economics of IS. We had lots of early literature from like a book from Nicholas Carr way back in the day, who was not an academic, but basically saying, where is the benefit of the technology? It doesn't show up in any of the productivity numbers. We don't see companies being more profitable. Technology is not helpful, which now in retrospect just sounds like ludicrous. Obviously, the issue was, yeah, on average, if you adopt technology, it might not help. It really depends how and what you do with it, was the point. And then we had a slew of papers, Eric Brynjolfsson and Lauren Hitt and Tim Bresnahan, et cetera, basically talking about that. You need to think about complementary resources in the organization, which might not just be, it might not be like capital, it might be how you organize around the technology as well. And so you get situations where once we take advantage of it properly, we get benefits. Okay. And you can think about these technologies as something that organization is adopting. It's automating a function that was there previously, which is dual. So the dual function that's being automated is one, proactively intervening in a deterrence kind of way. Like I'm going to try and find drugs or I'm going to find guns before something happens and take them off the street in a proactive manner. That can have a deterrent effect that people know police are out there, they're not going to do stuff. It can also, there's a monitoring component. So we are proactively monitoring for stuff to stop things from happening before they take place. You can think about the microphones as maybe doing both. So one, it may deter. If I know the microphones are there, I'm going to be less likely to at least engage in certain kinds of crime. And two, they're going to help me monitor. If something happens, I know about it and I get there, I respond and I deal with it faster. So it's an automation story from that perspective. And the point is it can have knock-on effects. So unintended consequences that need to be managed in the way we deploy these things and how we characterize the technology to our employees and to citizens and how we manage like understanding the signals we get from this tech and respond to those. And if not done thoughtfully, you may get negative effects, just like Nicholas Carr saw way back in the day. And this is meaningful because although this monitoring tech is different, so we do have also a long literature on monitoring technologies, which are mostly about solving information asymmetry problems with employees. Like a very recent example of this is a paper by Eric Brynjolfsson and Meng Lu at WashU and somebody at Uber, where they were looking at the benefits of, they were contrasting Uber drivers with taxi cab drivers and looking at the probability that an Uber driver would take you on a circuitous route versus a taxi driver. And they show Uber drivers don't do that, in part because there's monitoring. So there's a record of exactly where you went, but also in part because your fare is not a function of distance. It's a contract that's sort of committed to up front in the app. And so they look at like airport trips and show they take more direct routes. A little bit older, Lamar Pierce had a paper, his 2015 paper I'm citing here, which was about deploying monitoring tech in retail settings and showing that this reduces theft from employees within the retail setting, which makes sense. The knock-on effect, the unintended consequence, is we have lots of things about harm to performance of employees because people don't like being watched. It erodes trust. It makes me concerned about what you might see and think about what I'm doing. We know in like academic studies that the Hawthorne effect can change behavior when you have a camera on somebody and you're trying to study them, right? So there's all these negative consequences that can arise. It can demotivate people, et cetera, right? And so you need to manage these two things. And that's very well established in the literature. Here, we're talking about a monitoring technology that's not really focused on the employees. It's actually more focused on an external stakeholder, which is citizens. So you could think about this as somewhat analogous to the retail context where you have customers and employees being monitored, or cybersecurity, or there's various contexts where monitoring is actually a function of the organization. We need to be thoughtful in this context too. What could knock-on effects be? when we automate that monitoring process. That's kind of one thing that we're looking at here. Tons of papers on monitoring technologies in law enforcement. Most of them are about body-worn cameras and closed-circuit television, a little bit about gunshot tech of late. I won't say much, except that there's a lot of mixed evidence about the value of body cameras. That is directly monitoring primarily the employee, actually, and their behavior more than the citizens, although it's used for both also. A lot of papers that show that they don't necessarily work very well. Some of these, so the Zamoff et al. Paper is my paper at the end with Brad and a law professor at Minnesota, where we were looking at body camera deployments in New York City. Basically, one thing we found in that study that was very interesting is that the employees had control over when the monitoring was turned on. So they just wouldn't turn on the body-worn camera unless it was to their benefit to help cover them for something. And they would leave it off in other situations. So it actually made things worse. So decision rights and things mattered in that setting. So the point is we have lots of studies that show mixed evidence. Good explanation is probably going back to the IT doesn't work unless you use it properly story. Okay. So yes, Jiho, you have a question.
Yeah, probably I have missed it, but could you help me understand how GDTs can be seen as monitoring technology? Because I mean, it looks to me like it's not like attached to police officers, and um,
Hmm.
I mean, I mean, I'm having a
It's
hard time
not-
understanding like how it can be seen as monitoring like the activities done by police officers.
It's not, yeah, so this is the thing. Unlike that prior literature, this is why I mentioned the outset, why we're pivoting the paper to make it more an IT adoption by organization story and not a monitoring story, is that this is monitoring, but it's monitoring of an external stakeholder, not of employees. We're monitoring citizens. Quite literally, that's what they do, right? They sit and they listen and try to detect when a crime has happened. So they're monitoring for crime. But it's a very different kind of monitoring with a different purpose. Yeah. So I think that's probably where the disconnect is coming, but yeah, I'm aware of it.
Yeah, great, thank you.
Yeah, Alex.
I mean, just got wanted to ask at the end, but because Gia mentioned it, do does this potentially have a monitoring effect, though? Because it's gunshot microphone, so they'll pick up gunshots from police officers as well. And I was wondering if there could be one of the effects is there less gun use by officers, or yet less incidences of sh misfires or yeah, gun use by officers in those areas.
So that's not likely to be the case here, or in most like well-developed countries, because most law enforcement, if they fire their weapon, there's a lot of reporting that has to be done, and they literally count
Okay.
bullets.
Okay.
So if you bring it depends on the place. Like if I'm in the United States, I take my gun home with me, but there's a good chance somebody will find out eventually that the gun was fired and I never documented it, and you get in a lot of trouble for that. It's
Mhm.
even more strict in, say, Europe in many cities where you don't even take a gun home with you. You turn it in at the end of your shift, and then people log everything. So that depends a little bit on context. There's some potential, but not strong. If
Okay.
they use a gun, people usually know about it.
Okay.
Yeah, through other means. So yeah, the monitoring here is very much focused on the behavior of citizens, even more so than body cameras are. Yeah. So, okay, so where's the tension? So there's a few consequences. So broadly, again, we're focusing first and foremost on stop volumes, and then we're going to look at second order effects in terms of complaints and arrests and everything else secondly. So what can happen to stop volumes? There's reasons to think, first of all, that stop volumes might go up. And what is the reason for that? Well, it's twofold. One, that we may be catching crime that we wouldn't even hear about in the past because people wouldn't bother to phone it in. If I'm in a neighborhood where I'm maybe scared about getting involved with like gang activity or something in my neighborhood, like I may just not bother to make a phone call, or I may assume somebody else will, diffusion of responsibility, and then nobody calls. Now we automatically detect those when they happen and we alert the police and send someone. So that can drive an increase in the potential for citizen interactions. Two, police may just lie and use these as an excuse to show up and do what they want. A little bit of evidence for that from that Vice investigative report that found that happening. I doubt that's a super common thing because it seems pretty dangerous for the police to do that from a like employment standpoint, that they would get caught eventually and it would look really, really bad. So I don't imagine that's that common, but that's another sort of secondary reason you might see increased interactions with people as a result of this tech in a location. There's two reasons why you might see declines in interaction. The first, and I mentioned these at the outset, the first reason is these things maybe don't work very well and they're directing police away from where the real action is, and they're wasting their time following up on false things. That crowds out their ability to interact with citizens as much. They can't do these ad hoc foot stops as much anymore. And so fewer of them happen. Number two, maybe we get more efficient. We engage, we stop actively policing, we stop the ad hoc interactions, and we sit back and we wait for something to happen. So if a lot of the ad hoc interactions are driven by a desire to get guns off the street, and there is actually reporting of explicit policy that they do make use of ad hoc foot stops to recover guns and contraband and get them off the street, to the extent we rely on the tech to kind of pick up when stuff is happening and we kind of rest on our laurels, we may be less proactive now in the monitoring function. So that is both of those latter two reasons would result in a drop in stop activity. So we actually don't know a priori which of these two things is going to dominate. I'm probably looking for, on net, which thing's happening more. Okay, so this is, and then as far as the racial disparities component, we're also again looking at stop activity and seeing, do we see shifts in the racial composition of stops? If this is used as a pretext for people to do whatever they want, you might see that the police begin making more stops of citizens of color and using the gunshot tech as an excuse for doing so. Basically giving them the freedom to do what they want, kind of like body-worn cameras were doing when they could just choose to turn them on whenever they felt like it. They can kind of engage in misbehavior and cover their behavior using the tech. So we'll look at heterogeneity and the characteristics of people being stopped in a district to understand if that's happening. Okay, so our data. City of Chicago, we're looking between 2016 and December of 2019. The reason we have data that goes beyond that, the reason we stop is COVID, which led to a drop in police stopping anybody. Like they were worried at the time they were going to get sick, so they just stopped, they just disengaged. And you see it in the data. That said, if I extend my panel and look at the causal effect, basically what you see in an event study is it goes flat for a while and then it starts to fall again in terms of stop volumes later. We have data from a lot of different sources that we've compiled for the city. Some of it is public, some of it we obtained through Freedom of Information Act requests. So, which are basically sunshine laws. If they have it and it's not private, they have to give it to you when you ask for it, essentially. So the data on citizen foot stops, these are also known as Terry stops. It's just like New York City. At some point in 2015, the city of Chicago lost a lawsuit that they were engaging in inappropriate ad hoc stops of citizens on foot, the police, like stop and frisk. And they were doing it in a racially targeted way. And so they got a lawsuit, they lost it. And then a judge said, now you have to document it every single time you stop somebody. You got to write down why, and you have to write down their racial description. You have to document lots of things about the interaction. So we have that data. They're called investigative stop reports. We're aggregating this to the month district level. A district is a police district with administrative boundaries in the city. And we can aggregate in different splits of that data. So total stops, but then also stops involving white citizens, stops involving non-white citizens, stops involving that where a gun was found, for instance, or not. So there's a lot of ways we can split that data. We also have timestamps on that data, so we know when exactly the stops are happening in the course of the day, and they're GPS located, so we have very granular information on location. So I'm not necessarily using all of that, but just be aware of it in case you have thoughts about how I might use the data better. We then also have data not just on foot stops, but vehicle stops, vehicular stops. That's important because in COVID, the New York Times caught the city of Chicago shifting their foot stops, pre-COVID. In COVID, the New York Times went and did a massive audit and just all the public police data from lots of cities to see what were police doing because of COVID. And then they noticed back in time in 2015, when Chicago lost this lawsuit, they saw a drop in foot stops and then a spike in traffic stops. Basically, they just shifted the traffic stops to keep doing what they were doing to mask their behavior because it gets reported into a different system. So we want to make sure that's not happening here. So we have that data too from the state of Illinois. The city has to report the traffic stops to the state, and we get the data from them. It's public. We have data on crime reports for the city. This is public. So anytime a crime is logged, it may happen as a result of an ad hoc foot stop, a Terry stop, or it may happen through other means like now, ShotSpotter detects a gunshot. The police go. If they find shell casings or something, a crime is logged. For each crime, we have an indication of whether an arrest was ever made. Okay, so we can get something about closure rate with that. We then have, that's the next measure, right? And then we have one concern we had as an alternative explanation for the passive monitoring story, or maybe a mechanism, is that once they start passively monitoring, maybe they actually literally reallocate patrol officers to different districts. And so there's fewer stops because there's fewer cops. So we got a FOIA request where we got district staffing headcounts. So we have for every officer back to like 1989, what district were they assigned to for what weeks, and we can calculate patrol officer headcount volumes in each district over time and show a null result. They're not reallocating police. So I'll show you that. Then getting to this intensive margin of policing stuff, so like the aggression of officers, we have data on complaints by citizens against officers in each district at the complaint level. This comes from a different body. It's the Civilian Office of Police Accountability, which is a civilian oversight board that was created when the police department lost that lawsuit for stop and frisk. So they track complaints. You complain to them, not the police department, if you have one. And a FOIA request gives us data from there. And those are located. So basically, where did the event happen that led to my complaint? GPS located, right? And what was the nature of the complaint? So did the cop pull their gun on me without justification? Did they fail to identify themselves as an officer? Did they search me without cause, basically violating my rights, etc.? We then have microphone deployments. Sorry, Maria, you have a question.
Yeah. You have for several of these possibly racial data, right? I mean, you have
Yes.
racial data associated to the composition at different zip codes, but then do you also have racial data for arrests, for example?
So the arrest data that we are using is coming from the crime data set, and that does not indicate who was arrested. It's just a flag of was an arrest made. So I don't have that information in here.
And for court, do you have, because you've said that you have tied it to some judicial proceedings, do you have racial data there?
So that's in Houston. I don't have explicit racial data, but I do know people's names. So I could do racial coding, although as you may know, there's like pretty bad measurement error on racially coding using names, especially between white and black people. That's like the biggest source of error. So I could do that potentially. I've not done that.
Thanks.
No problem. Okay, and then on the treatment side, I know where all the microphones are, and the reason we focus on Chicago, originally we started this in New York. The challenge is we know where the microphones are, but we don't know when they were installed. I should be clear why I have this data. The reason I got on this project is Wired wrote an article about this company, basically saying, look up where the microphones are in your neighborhood. And they had an interactive map. And the reason they had the data is an employee who didn't like what was happening leaked the data to Wired. And then Wired posted an interactive map. And then I went to the JavaScript and I scraped all the GPS coordinates for all the microphones. So I don't know when the microphones were turned on. I just know that they were on. The reason we focus on Chicago is that Connealy et al., which are criminology folks actually at Northeastern here in Boston, they collaborated with the Chicago Police Department, who told them when did they turn their microphones on in each district. And we reused their deployment schedule for our study to get a causal design on various other outcomes that they never looked at. Okay, we can actually validate this pretty easily though. ShotSpotter data is reported publicly, so all the alerts, they're geolocated and the volumes are reported. You can see basically we validate their schedule by seeing that shots turn on in a district when they say they did. You can do this in other cities too. That's actually how we do it in Houston. It's just looking at when did shots start getting reported. Everything counts. I'm using log transforms here. We do this in various ways with different estimators. I can come back to that if you're curious, but basically things are pretty consistent and you see these pretty clean effects. So here's the rollout schedule in Chicago. On the right is that map of Chicago again. I'm not making use of specific GPS coordinates of microphones. I am just making use of the timing when all the microphones got turned on in a district. So on the left, you can see all the different districts and treatment schedule. There's several districts where they never did deploy microphones, which end up being our control group. They're never treated. And then on the right, you can see going from blue to green is earlier to later activation of microphones. There's two little purple zones there. That was a trial run. So that was, they installed microphones on a small few city blocks, square city blocks, in two places in Chicago back in 2012, way before our study. we basically we've done some robustness checks where we basically treat District 7 and District 11 as having been treated back in 2012, and you still see the same kind of consequences in the results. So it's not driving anything. Um, we're not going to contend. It's very obvious up front that there's cross-sectional correlation between microphone locations and the racial composition of a neighborhood. What's less clear is dynamics, so selection and the timing of activation. Like, do they turn these on earlier in certain neighborhoods versus others that are predisposed to show effects, that kind of thing. That we'll be worried about that more later. Okay. All right. So the first thing we do is to try to validate that, yeah, the schedule looks like it's right. So we leverage the data that ShotSpotter, like the public data set on ShotSpotter reports for the city of Chicago, where we just regress ShotSpotter call volumes, the logarithm, onto an indicator of treatment. And then we also have measures of how many rounds were fired. So you can aggregate the count of rounds and do the same thing. If I do an event study plot, it's pretty clear. It goes from 0 and then just starts to rise. So the schedule looks accurate. We're staggered treatments here, so we're not using two-way fixed effects. We're using an imputation-based estimator to avoid forbidden comparison problems. If you're aware of that literature, just understand that we're not just throwing traditional OLS at this because of the problems that can arise. So, yes, microphones are activating when that paper said they were. Now what we're going to do, and this is, by the way, the same kind of, this is not actually what I estimate. This is just to give you intuition for what we're doing. We are accounting for district fixed effects. So these are going to be within district effects over time. And we're also accounting for time fixed effects. So we're accounting for whatever's happening across the city of Chicago at any point in time. And so what we're getting is you turn on microphones and how does this outcome shift within this district compared to ones that haven't got microphones yet. All right. And we do this in two primary ways: matrix completion, which is an imputation-based estimator, and then Gardner two-stage diff and diff is another form of imputation estimator. I can get into this if you're really curious. We're clustering at the district level. We don't have that many districts. There's like 22 to 25. So we're also going to do some robustness around that later. Wild cluster bootstrap for dealing with the small cluster count. So I'll show you average treatment effects on the treated first. So to be clear, these are not average treatment effects because the microphones are not getting dropped at random. They're getting put in very specific places. And I don't believe you would see the same effects if you did put these microphones in control districts because it's very different crime rates. The police behave very differently in those locations. So I'm making no claims about that. Our goal is just to understand what's happening retrospectively in the places that got microphones. Okay. We find a drop in stops. So stop volumes where police report interactions with people on foot are not going up. They're actually falling. This is true across both white citizens and non-white citizens. Okay, and I'll do an event study plot in a second to show you that this is not a pre-trend. It starts to fall after the microphones get turned on. And it is not explained by reallocations of police. So they're continuing to operate the way they did before in terms of head count, but they are just not interacting with as many people as they used to. So we're immediately getting into the territory of, okay, is it because they're passively monitoring now, or is it because they're wasting their time on things that are not, they should not be? Okay. This is in grayscale. I apologize. It was a journal requirement for the last journal we sent this to. So we're going back to color now. But anyway, relatively flat, and then things start to fall. It's not discontinuous. Why is it not discontinuous? This was passive monitoring by policy. This is behavior takes time to shift. So this gradual effect kind of suggests either there's some evolving understanding of the technology and how we should think about what it's telling us, or this is actually more in line with that than it is with the technology misdirects us. Because if it was technology is misdirecting us, you would see more of a discontinuous effect, right? You would expect that to immediately happen. That now it's giving us new signals and we're going to chase them and it's taking us off path. So the fact that this is happening in a more gradual way suggests the drop is happening because of shifts in behavior towards passive monitoring, right? As they feel like they don't need to be as proactive anymore as they used to be. And by the way, this is 3 sets of series. So the dark black is stops in general. And then we have white versus non-white stops, which are all kind of falling, although a little bit noisily. So you get significant effects start roughly 1 year post, and they persist. And actually, we never really reach equilibrium because when I've looked at this in the long run, adding another like 30 months to the data, it continues to fall. And so it's gradual, right? Part of this could be that these particular neighborhoods, they feel more comfortable not engaging and they're happy to have a reason not to be out there proactively policing in these neighborhoods. I'm not sure, but that's worth noting. Here's the effect on head count. So using the same, this is matrix completion estimator still, it's noisy, but it stays essentially flat. Nothing's happening in these districts that's unique in terms of head count. Okay, so why would stops be falling? Well, maybe there's less crime. So this goes to the other possibility, which I can tell you right away is not what's happening, but that maybe people are just committing less crimes. And so there's less reason to be out there on the street. Maybe there's a very successful deterrent effect. Microphones go up, I don't commit crimes because I don't want to get in trouble. Could also mean, by the way, that I move to a district that doesn't have microphones. So that's a spatial spillover problem that we will deal with. Crime is negative and null, right? So we don't see a significant shift in crime reports. It's not a small volume problem. There's not a power issue. Like there's a lot of crime. It's basically just not moving. Okay. So crime closure rates, however, are going up. So they are making more arrests despite crime volumes are not shifting, which is consistent with these things are helping us solve crimes, which is the mayor of Boston's claim. It is also consistent with we're going to find somebody and arrest them no matter what. And if you're nearby when I get there, sorry. So, yeah. If we look specifically at gun-related crime, that's where a lot of the action's happening here as well, which is sort of like consistent. This sanity check. It's what we would expect to see. Okay. Now, coming back to this idea about the intensive margin of policing. So we're interacting with fewer people, but the ones we interact with, we're doing so in a kind of a more problematic way. We see a very large increase in complaints, and I'll show you event study plots for this in a second too. There's a negative effect here on weapon complaints. One thing I want to mention, that effect is significant, but when I show you in the event study, it's not particularly large in the grand scheme of things in terms of magnitudes. It's sort of negative and borderline. Improper search complaints are spiking pretty clearly, which is basically I'm going in and I'm searching you and I don't have a reason to be searching you. And my justification, our claim, is that it's probably the shot spotter call gave me reason to think something's happening here and I'm going to find a gun. Okay, so we see pretty clear evidence that there is a spike in improper search complaints, which is largely driving the overall effect on complaints against officers in treated districts. So what you can see there on the bottom, the weapon use complaints, that's what I was saying. There is a negative effect, but it's not particularly large nor persistent. The primary effect that's causing the increase in overall complaints is improper search complaints that are spiking. We do have other categories of complaints I will mention, but those are noisy and null, and they tend to be rarer as a category. Yeah. You have a question?
It's actually a really basic question. I was curious about this weapons part. So it's when the police actually use weapons in that scene, but if they already assume that a weapon has been discharged in that area, then how come their weapon use is going down? Wouldn't you go in perhaps a little bit more guns blazing, or at least have them ready at hand?
So this isn't necessarily saying that they don't draw their weapons as much. It's just saying that the complaints are not going up about it. I do actually think that you're right, that the police are showing up very aggressive. Like they're going into a situation where their belief is that there's going to be guns here. And so they're like fear for their life. They're going to show up, they're going to be more aggressive, and they're going to find somebody. And they probably show up in larger groups. So my expectation would be if a gun goes off, police call for backup like right away. So they're not just going to send one car for that. They're going to show up as like 4 or 5 cars are going to show up, which also creates, yeah, there's like there's all kinds of social dynamics that come with that we don't get to see directly, but it's speculative, but I think it's probably part of what's going on. Yeah. So this the main point in response to your question is this doesn't imply that their weapons are being drawn less often. It just means that people are not complaining about it more. Yeah. Okay. So we're trying to think. So crime is not going down. Head counts are not going down. So the same number of people are around. So this is not an exposure thing that's driving this result. This is, it seems, active choices are being made on the part of police that are leading to a decline in stop volumes. So this takes us to the part where we're trying to disentangle, okay, is that active choice that's driving this a decision to take a step back and wait for something to happen? Or is it I'm following up on calls that are false and wasting time? Alex, yeah.
Yeah, I was just wondering if and maybe I didn't understand correctly, but can you account for specific crime or gun crime in particular shifting to other areas? So it's not a total reduction, but let's just say we assume assuming it's gang violence, assuming there's communication among gang members, and there is a knowledge that in these districts now there is, this shot spotting technology. So let's shift our gun violence to one of the other areas. I mean, that's a very rational perspective, but I'm wondering if that's something you can account for, that potentially it's actually coordinated to move into your control areas, basically. So it's not a reduction in gun crime, it's an increase in your control group, Satva, more or less.
Yeah. So I will do something to try to rule that out later, which is I'll remove control districts that are on the border of a treated district. It's possible they're moving even further, but we're just making the assumption if they're going to move kind of to the neighboring district. And so we'll drop those bordering controls and repeat the estimation, and we can still see negative effects on stop volumes when we do that, which suggests that it's not driven by spatial spillovers. But yeah, that's a fair point. I mean, the other part of this, so one is the dependent variable could move between districts. The other is technically the treatment can move between districts because sound travels. So if I have microphones on the border of the district, I may detect gun crime at a corner where I have triangulation ability in a neighboring district. And so actually it's not a control district. It's also being treated in some sense for that reason, possibly. So this is the main reason we did the drop the neighbors approach, but it also deals with what you're saying a little bit too. Okay. So there's several things I'm going to go through here to try to get at what's going on. I will come back to this, why is the negative effect happening in a second. The first thing we want to deal with, though, is try to think about selection mechanisms that might be a concern. We'll think about the SETVA violation problems. One pivot that we're making in the paper right now is to take the mechanism behind the negative effect and bring it forward in the paper and make it a main result, whereas previously it was ruling out an alternative explanation. Hence the sequencing. So the first thing we're going to do is try to see, okay, we're making no claims that obviously there's cross-sectional selection in terms of locations of these microphones. They're putting them in very specific places and they're very public about that when they announce it. That's not our concern. That drives an interpretation of an average treatment effect on the treated. What we're more worried about is the timing in which they turn them on. So the sequence in which they enable these things. And we'd be concerned that maybe the dynamics of crime in a district cause them to turn them on more like earlier in one place versus another. And that might be affecting our estimations. So we're going to try to rule that out by seeing is there an association between lags of crime activity and when microphones are enabled. And essentially what we'll show is it doesn't seem like it. So we look at the logarithm or the raw level of crime over the prior year before. So what we do is we take our panels in any district that gets microphones. The first time the microphones are turned on, we delete every month after that from the panel. And then you could use this to fit a logistic hazard model, right? A logit discrete hazard model to see if the hazard of adoption is a function of recent crime activity. We do that. We also do this as like a linear probability model just for interpretability. Anyway, everything is noisy and there's no clear associations happening. Now, if I want to be really good about this, I would probably train a predictive model and just see, can I predict adoption timing with historical crime, d-means or something like that? I haven't done that, but we could. This suggests that there's no association happening, though, in terms of the time with respect to recent crime. It's possible that this is like a longer running thing. So we turn on first in places that have the highest volume of crime cross-sectionally also. That's less of an issue if that's true, because that's a static characteristic in some sense. It's like you're a high crime historical neighborhood, and that's accounted for by the district fixed effects. Okay, so it doesn't seem like we have any selection problems here dynamically. Yeah, Gio.
No, just out of curiosity, then, like, what's the reason that some of the areas got this technology implemented first? if that's not because of the historical crime rate was high.
So I think it is because of the historical crime rate, but it's not like granular and dynamic. It's not like you had the most crime last year or last month. It is historically since the 1960s, you're the highest crime neighborhood. We're starting with you. So
Mhm.
more like a static trait as opposed to like granular dynamics.
Okay, okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay. Second thought, is this all driven by one district? I mean, that's something we might be worried about. There's a lot of heterogeneity in crime volumes. So maybe everything's coming from like a couple of districts where the crime is heaviest. And this is not like a general thing. It's specific, like very granular geographies where this is coming from. So we want to know like how general is this effect, at least across Chicago. So what we do is this sort of leave one out analysis where we systematically drop one of the districts and repeat the whole estimation. And we do this with every district individually omitted to try to see do the effects ever fall apart. Mostly, so when it comes to complaints, the effects are always there. Doesn't matter which district we throw out of the data set, which suggests it's a pretty general effect on that intensity of policing. The stop volume effects are always there until, and this one's still borderline. So it is technically significant, but it's right at the edge. If we omit district number one, the effect gets a little bit smaller in terms of stop volumes. And why? Let me show you that map again. If you look on the right, district number one is Miracle Mile, where the bean is, if you've ever been to Chicago. It's a small district, and it's basically wrapping around a treated district, which is District 9, and bordering District number 2. It's not very large. Sound carries. It's very plausible that it's treated, actually. And so its inclusion in the control group could be driving something somehow. So this is, again, going to help motivate our set of violation check where we're going to drop that district plus the other neighboring ones and then look at the stop volume effects dynamically when we do that. And what you'll see is the effects are still there, actually. They're just getting noisier. Yeah. So here's what happens with stop volume effects on the left when I omit all these districts that border a treated district. So if we drop 1, 12, 14, 17, 16, and 22. So we're using these four in the top right, end up being our control districts. You still see these negative effects. They take a little bit longer to show up. They become significant by the end of the panel, but it's not as quick, so it's noisier. Okay. So it doesn't seem like spatial spillovers are just causing everything, but there's something going on there that we need to be worried about with that particular district, actually. Okay. I mentioned the stuff about traffic stops. We want to make sure this is not just unique to foot stops, that they're not shifting stops to vehicles because they've done that in the past. And that's not happening. Traffic stops are going down too. So vehicular stops are going down in these districts as well. Okay. Now to the other part. Is it about misdirection, or is it about passive monitoring and efficiency? So like the concern would be there's a lot of shots being triggered in some of these districts. They have to follow up on all of them it's like required, and they're going to send a lot of police because they think there's a gun. And so there's a huge resource shift happening when that takes place. And to investigate one of these calls, it's been reported, takes at least 20 to 30 minutes, even if nothing has happened and you never find anything. You got to look around, you got to canvass a little bit, which means go knock on some doors and ask if anybody heard anything. It's worth mentioning that is not an investigatory stop. That doesn't get documented in my data because the person's not a suspect. They are a possible witness where they're just asking, did you hear anything? So to the extent this happens a lot, and we do get some districts where you're getting, and you see in the bottom right, the density distribution of shot calls per district month. We have a lot of zeros. That's your control districts. And then it's not uncommon for districts to have 100 or 200 calls for service on the basis of shots being fired in a month. If each one of those is taking 20 or 30 minutes to follow up on, and you're getting a whole bunch of cops showing up to deal with it, that's a lot of resources in a given month. The red density distribution is the distribution of calls for service more broadly across districts. So it's not a massive fraction, but these get a lot of attention. So on the left, I'm showing you, this is public data from a dashboard from the city of Chicago. They categorize calls for service by priority. And a gunshot is going to be level 0 or level 1 priority, which is like a high priority event. And so they're like a relatively large fraction of events in the city are high priority events, but this is going into that. And you can imagine a lot of resources will go behind it in response, even though the absolute number of calls may not be that large compared to other stuff like vandalism calls and other things. Okay, so there's potential for efficiency challenges. So what am I going to do? I've been trying to think about what can I do with my data to try to understand a bit more about, is this misdirection through false positives, or is it passive monitoring that's happening? I'm not sure that this answers the question, but it's an interesting dynamic that is consistent with what you would maybe expect to see once these microphones get turned on. So this is showing you, I repeat the analysis. I estimate the average treatment effect on the treated in my model, so like a DID, single point estimate. And I'm doing it splitting the stop data by hour of the day when the stop took place. So 0 is between midnight and 1 a.m., 1 is 1 to 2 a.m., etc. And so over the course of the day, you can see in the background a histogram, which is actually a density histogram, which is showing you the density of stops in general by that hour of the day across the whole city. And you can see, like, as you might expect, after 1 a.m., like crime activity or calls for service mostly fall and go to 0. Nothing's really happening between 3 and like 6 or 7 a.m. And then calls start to pick up again in the morning once people wake up, and they're busiest. Most calls are happening in the early evening and into the late night. When you look at the estimated effects of the microphones, they're driving systematic increases in stops in the morning that were not otherwise happening. This, I would contend, is the catch-all part of it. There's things that are happening that nobody ever would have been showing up to, and they have Slack resources in the system to go check it out, and they're still able to make stops in the area while they're there. So the gunshot detection stuff in the early morning, it's like a low demand time on the police. And so this just triggers them to do more stuff and see more people, interact with more people. Later in the day, when you get into the evening, when they're typically very busy, you actually see a reduction. They're stopping, there's fewer ad hoc stops of citizens happening in the evening now, specifically. And the argument there is we're getting gunshots. They are potentially overloading the system. And so now I'm losing the ability to do all the things I would have done in the past. Or maybe this is the time of day when I sit back and I passively monitor now. This doesn't actually answer my question, is what I'm saying. I thought it would, but it's still, I mean, I'm trying to think about what to do with the characteristics of the stops. And at least we're seeing a pattern that makes sense. It's at least a sanity check, if nothing else. But I think it says something about Slack resources in the system and when the gunshots are happening and how resource allocation happens as a result. Alex, yeah.
Yes, I was wondering also towards the mechanism of the lower stops from just like from a human perspective, and I might be biased here because I'm not a police officer, but I'm just wondering if the the timing is different between a 911 call to get you to wherever you have to go versus the gunshot call. And me as a human being, I would not be very excited to go to a location where there 90% there'll be someone with a gun and my life will be in danger. Versus potentially in another situation, there might be a gun, there might not be a gun, there might be a family dispute, whatever. And so I was wondering if there might be some kind of human behavior aspect, or it might not, it might just be also preparation aspect. I don't know how police works. Like, do they have to gear up? Do they have to have a talk before? Do they have to set up a lot more if they know they're going to a gunshots situation? Or if it's some other violent crime that may fall into the same level of importance, or but they don't have to prepare. And so to get at that, I was wondering if you had data on the response time for these shots. What's it called? I keep forgetting the name. The shot mics, shot spotter, versus the response times to just your regular emergency calls.
So I don't have data right now on dispatch calls. So I have like what happens as a result of a call is a way of thinking about it, which in various ways, but I don't have like what was dispatch doing, like when was dispatch directing police. There is data. I know the data exists on response times because there have been like news media reports studying what happened to police response times when calls to defund the police started happening and the police got mad, stopped showing up to deal with stuff. So the data's there. I don't have it.
Okay.
It's something I'm thinking about. There is 911 call data because so So there's a few things here. One, what you're describing is like measures maybe of to get at the mechanisms of what's happening with resource allocation. Yeah.
Yeah.
Uh, so that's a good thought, which I will write down. 1 sec. Maybe we just need to FOIA more data. Yeah, so I don't have that data, but it's a good idea. The other thing that it's easy to get because it's publicly available that I've not worked with yet is 911 call data.
Mhm.
So the other thing that's there is that people wouldn't always phone in a crime, and now there's no choice. It's being flagged by the system. And so one thing I've not looked at is what's happening in the relationship, the effect of the deployment of microphones on 911 calls, because it may cannibalize some
Mm.
911 calls because the cops are already there by the time you would have called. So that's something we're going to look at as well. I think that might tell us something here because to the extent 911 calls are not being replaced, it kind of suggests that they're showing up to things that people like there's nobody there that would have been calling that in, which means maybe it's a false positive. As compared to if it's something that would have been called in by a police or to the police, had they not shown up so fast, that suggests they're picking up on stuff that's more real. Now, I realize that runs counter to my point that there's stuff that never gets called in. But I
Mhm.
feel like it might say something about is it a false positive or not? Is it a misdirection or not that's happening? That's where my head's going right now. But the dispatch data is a good idea too.
I'm just wondering if there really will be a cannibalization because I feel like if this is related to gun crime, if the if the police show up early enough, this would have happened regardless of the gun spotter or not. I mean, if you hear a gunshot and you decide to report it via phone, you're not going to wait for 10 minutes and then say, I guess I heard a gunshot 10 minutes ago, nobody's here. You'd either not do it because you're scared, or you do it after you immediately hear the gunshot.
So
And yeah.
I can say that there is documented stuff. The Office of the Inspector General of Chicago has found that the police respond like 2 to 3 times faster to ShotSpotter in terms of the time for them to be on scene after
Mm.
the event has happened. It's much faster. I guess because when you call 911, you have a conversation, maybe you're scared, you have to tell them stuff for them
Mm.
to really know
Mm.
what's going on and what they should be doing. They don't even know it's a gunshot until you say it.
Mm.
Versus ShotSpotter's like immediate, and so they arrive in 5 to 10
Mm.
minutes as compared. It's like twice as fast at least as what normally
Mm.
would have been happening.
Mm.
So they're getting there
Mm.
quicker. So this is not like the negative
Okay.
effect in terms of it's not about like we're arriving later and there's no one to talk to. It's actually the opposite. They're arriving faster.
Okay. Okay. So yeah. All right. Okay.
Yeah. Maria, you have a question?
Yeah, well, with the 911 calls, it's not, there's definitely ways of incorporating it in interesting ways. I would worry about heterogeneity in trust in the police. I think that there's a lot of neighborhoods where people won't trust the police, and so they're not going to call because they worry about putting their neighbors in danger, they worry about putting themselves in danger.
That's true.
That's one thing. And then the other one was about this plot, and I'm not sure that I understood the details of the model specification, but when I see it, it seems, if I'm understanding it correctly, it seems consistent with the initial explanation of them relying on these for for surveillance instead of doing it in person, because I can assume that maybe they do more active surveillance in the evening because it's when it is, they have an idea of things being more dangerous. I think
Mhm.
it's very likely that they do random stops for criminals at like 8 a.m. in the morning, whereas shot stopper, like gun spotter, does activate in the morning. It doesn't have these. Basically, this would be taking away the kind of surveillance bias of you find crime where you look for it, or you find crime at the time of the day that you look for it. And so before they were more likely to be identifying it in the evenings versus here in the mornings. So
Yeah. So just to be clear, the specification here, every single one of these point estimates is a different estimation. And the dependent variable is volume of stops in a district month between midnight and 1, between 1 and 2. So I'm running a bunch of different regressions, splitting the outcome variable. And then the bars are just the general density distribution of stops by time of day in the whole data set.
Yeah,
To your point, I don't disagree with you. I think it is consistent with that. I think the issue is that it's also consistent with misdirection. So
mhm,
if you look when this like maybe the reason that they weren't stopping anybody between like the early hours, it picks up around 6 a.m. when traffic starts and cars backfire and like so basically false positives can start happening at that time, which is triggering them to go like look around and they're looking for a gun. And then they start talking to people they see walking by and stopping them. And then in the afternoon or evening, they would have been stopping people in an ad hoc way, doing proactive stuff. And then shot spotter reports are being stacked on top of that. And it's cannibalizing their ability to do what they would have done before because it's misdirecting them somewhere else now. So this, my problem is it's still consistent with both stories,
yeah,
basically.
yeah, yeah, that's what I meant. Yeah. Okay, yeah.
So I'm trying to figure out. So the dispatch idea, like how quickly do I show up, is a maybe a good one way of getting at this. Yeah. The other thing would be look that I've thought about is looking at how detailed are the descriptions, like the amount of reporting they're doing in a stop, like how much time are they taking to say who they talk to. Like maybe if they're under pressure, they actually write shorter notes. So I can look at that too. So I'm trying to get at it with circumstantial evidence, basically. We'll see.
I wonder if there's any other activity that is a proxy for low busyness. Like, yeah, as you say, like, oh, they took the time to write notes or they took the time to, like, I wonder if there's any logged activity that indicates.
Police officer check-ins at Dunkin' Donuts. Uh, yeah. So yeah, I'm actively, yeah. So this is what we're thinking about as we're trying to do this. We fortunately get a year to do a revision of management science, but I hope it doesn't take that long. Yeah, Alex, you have another question? I think I see you have a question.
Yeah, I just wanted to pile on top of that, maybe also related to behavior where I mean if you go to a site due to shot spotter, you'll probably I can imagine you're much more diligent and you're really looking for someone that fired a gun. And I don't know the US system. All I know it's very complicated and you need to do a lot of reporting. And that may lower the quantity of stops you would usually do because now you're on the scene. You're expecting that will be something to do with guns. You'll be more vigilant. So maybe that the time of I don't know how you would measure that if you can measure that, but all the kind of the process of each stop,
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
like
I
the
can.
documentation, maybe that would explain because you only have police officers have so many hours in a day, and maybe the stops they do are more involved now.
Mm-hmm. Well, I
Um,
mean, one thing that's occurred to me is that I can look at the average time between stops
hmm,
conditioned on the volume. So it's sort of like I don't know how to think about that. Like I think the time between stops is going to go up if I'm making fewer stops. So I have to think about that. But I feel like that's the best I could do is I do have timestamps on when they're stopping people. So if they're taking more time between
mhm,
interactions, maybe there's a way to take advantage of that somehow.
yeah.
Yeah. Asim, you have a thought?
Uh, Very interesting research, Gordon. Thank you for presenting it. I have two questions. The first one is, uh, I mean, you don't have the data, but is there sort of a learning effect both from the sides of criminals who know where the initially where these microphones are, and then maybe they change their patterns later, and the ML algorithm running those. So, like we see large language models getting better over time, maybe they tweak their algorithms a bit over a period of time. That's one question. Then the second question is there are neighboring technologies like geofencing and stuff where a crime is committed, and then detectives look at geofencing, and then there's some sort of measurement error there. So when you say triangulation of the gunshots, uh, do they sort of back it up with geofencing or something like that? And is that data available? So.
No, so okay, so the second question I'll start with first. So the triangulation has nothing to do with like mobile phones or anything. It's pure auditory. So we just hear a gunshot and we can pinpoint the latitude and longitude if we have three microphones that can how long, like what's the sound, volume, etc. How far away was the sound? We can pinpoint where it happened. So there's nothing to do with GPS tech on a phone. to your first question about learning, it doesn't seem like criminals are learning because crime doesn't appear to be moving around. So crime stays flat. It's still happening in the same way. As far as algorithm, this is the interesting thing. So first of all, there's no feedback loop. So they don't know when their reports were correct or not. So it's hard for them to optimize and make it better. And this goes to a bigger, broader point, which this is a context where you're dropping in this technology, which is guiding policing, where you don't actually know error metrics. And you don't even technically know what they would look like before you deployed the thing in testing, because it's not like they're testing it in the city on the skyscrapers and stuff, and sound bounces around and is weird, right? So they test it in a controlled environment where it's like open and we can be on a gun range and shoot off a gun and see does it detect it and pinpoint it properly. But you're never going to do that test in a city because you're not going to randomly send people around and fire off guns at different times of day and then see if it picked it up properly. So you can literally never know the error metrics here. So it's like a weird context where it suggests you should not be using this at all because there's literally no ability to audit its capabilities.
That's very concerning.
Yeah, it is very concerning, right? This is why so there's reports that it looks like there's a lot of false positives, but we literally don't know because maybe those aren't false positives. The ones where they followed up the 95% and they never got anybody, that might just mean that the person got away. It doesn't mean nothing happened.
Yeah, so if they are taking 10 minutes to arrive, you might as well, the criminals will run away, right?
Depends. Like shootouts can take a little bit of time. If you have enough people, you might still be there. Yeah.
Okay. Fascinating research. Thank you for your time today. Yeah.
You're welcome. Maha, yeah.
And this again is a really basic question. I'm curious as to when you say crime doesn't go down, was it gun crime or crime? Because I'm thinking more in the UK, because I'm sorry, prior to coming to Barcelona, I've lived all my life in the UK. Guns are not allowed and they're not easily accessible as they are, of course, in the US. But we have a lot of knife crimes. So do people change the tools and the weapons that they use?
So my thing is specifically crime in general is not shifting around. If we look specifically at gun crime, that's not changing either. So it's like we don't see any evidence that shifts are happening, but they may be to some extent. It's just not enough that we can detect it. We're not in like a high power situation here statistically. Yeah. So there's that. And then the other thing I looked at here is I would expect that if this was a passive monitoring thing, then when the microphones are turned on, stops fall, right? It shouldn't be a function of how many shots are getting reported. So the one thing I have that suggests that this is a resource issue is that as the number of stop alerts go up, you're seeing a bigger decline in stop volumes in a district. So what this is, every single one of these point estimates is a separate, this is a single regression actually. And what I'm doing is district fixed effects, time fixed effects, and I am looking at within district variation in shot caller reports. So this is relative to the zero group, which is no microphones. And what we're looking at is the shot call volumes go up. So we have 0 to 25, sorry, 1 to 25, 26 to 50, et cetera, different buckets of shot call volumes. As the call volumes increase within a district, we see a bigger drop off in average stop volumes in that district. So this is the one thing I do have, which is directly indicative of a misdirection thing that is a resource allocation problem where you are seeing substitution as a function of volume of alerts. It plateaus though. So once I get up to over 100 calls in a month in a district, it's just maybe the implication is that like we've reached the limits of resources and so it can't get any worse or something like this. Like we just don't do ad hoc stops anymore. I don't know. But the other thing that's worth mentioning is like the density of data. Once you get beyond 125 calls or so, there's not that many district months where that happens. That's like the most heavy crime districts where that's taking place. So it's limited data. So this is one thing I think we can point at that goes more towards the misdirection story. Yeah. Okay. So just in the interest of time, I only have like 5 minutes left here. So In general, so what do? We're looking at gunshot detection technology. We're going to present this as a monitoring technology, but one for external stakeholders. It is primarily an automation technology as a result. It's automating deterrence and monitoring, a job that police engage in. And the question is, how does this affect their ability to achieve their objectives as an organization, which are dual and twofold? One is about serving citizens and helping them. The other is about crime deterrence and prevention. And you see this as kind of like I don't know how to think about these in more abstract terms, but like an efficiency story and like a trust story. And so the technology shifts these two things in different ways. So like if it all really depends to some extent on like how good is the technology, like what is the accuracy of this thing, and how do police perceive it? Are they aware of the accuracy? Neither of these two things are probably great. So one, we have no idea how accurate it is, and it's actually kind of impossible to check. Number two, the police seem to assume, like it seems consistent with an assumption that it's right. When I get a call, I have to, or at least I have to assume that it's right, because it's very risky for me not to assume that it's right, and I behave accordingly. And we end up in this territory where we're maybe reallocating people in inefficient ways, and they're just trusting it because they have to and respond to what it says. And then as a result, based on these baseline assumptions, they show up, and then now they're not only misdirected and doing less proactive investigation, which may be a good thing, arguably, right? Because crime's not going up. But when they do interact with people now, it is more aggressive and not great. And they do end up making an arrest with greater likelihood, but it's not clear that it's a correct arrest. So what's the final story here? Well, it's murky, as real life is. So we're not saying that it's bad or it's good. It seems to be leaning more on the bad side in the sense that it's misdirecting police, but in a way that has spillover benefits, because the fact that crime doesn't shift sort of suggests that the misallocation is resulting in fewer ad hoc stops that didn't need to be happening in the first place.
So thank you again. I'm trying to think, if I was somebody who's been in the police force for a number of years and I've been following up on this technology, so I go there and then I see somebody who's been shot or hasn't, and if over time I see more and more people that there's no sign of any shooting, or at least I'm not sure whatever their indicators, other than a body, I'm not sure what other indicators they might have, shells or whatever. So for them, why do they have so much faith in it, or why are they forced to have faith in it, meaning that they must go no matter whether, so there's no choice in this, if over time they've at least understood that this is effective as a technology or it isn't, because they must have some gut feeling.
Yep. So 95% of calls are nothing. 5% of calls amount to something. If I show up to 1 out of 20 alerts and someone's dead, I go into this with an assumption like there's a very high probability that I'm going to encounter a gun right now, even if there's a high probability also that I won't. I err on the side of caution. Like that's a lottery ticket I don't want to punch. So that's my answer about what's going on there. Alex.
I was just thinking about this misdirection thing, and I mean, there's the aspect of the police officers, but there's also the aspect of the criminals, and this will, I think, depend on how much of the crime in Chicago is of the organized versus just the ad hoc crime. Because if officers are aware of this technology, criminals are aware of this technology, and it seems to be something that's very easy to manipulate. If I'm planning to, do some robbery, I'll get one of my people to light a firecracker or to fire something that sounds like a gun in one place, so that it distracts the police, it gets all the police somewhere else, and then I can do my other crime. So, I mean, that's probably hard to assess, but I'm wondering if that could be a mechanism that could be checked with if the number of, because you mentioned 95% aren't anything, 5% are something, if that number shifts over time and potentially like lagged reportings of crime. Like, is there, after like one of these gunshots, is there a spike in or some increase in calls to 911 because of something completely different? Or I don't know how granular your crime data is, but is there some effect on other kinds of property crime or something like that? Because it seems like this technology is very easily manipulatable, and if I were a career criminal, I would want to kind of take advantage of 6 police cars having to show up every time something sounds like a gun went off.
So, I guess my response to that would be uh, what you just described as misdirection thing wouldn't be that hard to do without the microphones. Like, if I wanted to do that, I could go set off, like, I could go shoot off a gun or have someone go shoot a gun in another district. And probably if that happens enough, I'm going to get police getting called. I don't think that this is organized crime in necessarily in the way you're thinking about it. Like
Right.
there's a lot of gang crime in Chicago, and they have very specific reporting in the stops of gang member affiliation and things like this. Uh, I think it's a lot of weapon crime in relation to drugs.
Okay.
So essentially, like it's not like we're organizing and trying to go rob a bank. Like this is like
Yeah.
we're holding our corner kind of thing. And so it's not that thoughtful. I mean, I don't know. I don't know this. I'm not a cop. I will say that the reviewers asked us to go talk to patrol officers in Chicago about this. And I'm skeptical that a patrol officer is going to want to talk to me about this, at least not an active duty one, and maybe say something that doesn't look good on the police department. So that's not really going anywhere. We are talking to some prosecutors, like former prosecutors, about their perception of the cases, at least that they get. But I think this is a weird setting. I'm not John Van Manen. I'm not like hanging out with the police and seeing everything that they do, which is pretty interesting papers, honestly. Read them if you haven't. But like, so
Yeah.
I'm speculating a little, but my perception of what's actually going on in these cities is not that organized.
Right. Right. So okay. So then, yeah,
It's more
that kind
reactive.
of at least that rules out one potential mechanism then.
Yeah, well, it doesn't rule it out, but like I'm like relatively confident that it's not that. So again, crime is flat, but you're right. Like types of crime might all be going up in multiple districts at the same time if they are organized. Yeah, so I don't know for sure, but I speculate otherwise.